I've known Randy for just a few years. Bill and I met. Well, we met in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport on our way to Ghana, West Africa in 2001, and became best friends just immediately. We've been like brothers since then. And so I came out a couple of days early to see Bill, and I'll be back in Crandall for a meeting in October. And so, don't want to spend too much time talking about Bill. We want to talk about Jesus this morning. Our theme is for Christ and the church, and our emphasis this morning is on Christ Himself. And then this morning's sermon will be the matter of the Sermon on the Mount. But with regard to our lesson this morning, Jesus never won like Him. Now, the title comes from John chapter 7 and verse 46. Now, we're not going to spend any time there. I'm just telling you where the title came from. But just to give you the background to the title, the theme, in John 7 and verse 32, Jesus is in the middle of His public ministry, and a number of Jewish officers are sent to Jesus by the Pharisees to take Him into custody. Well, when those men came to Jesus, and then they saw how Jesus dealt with people, and they heard how Jesus dealt with those who were in opposition to Him, they were astonished, and they went home empty-handed. And when their superiors approached them, they said, "Why have you not brought him?" And the answer was this: never before has a man spoke like this man. And there it is. Never before has a man spoke like this man. And I thought about that phrase, and I thought, there are a lot of things about Jesus where we could say never anybody else like Him. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to look at some of the attributes of Jesus and His life and His work under the theme, never one like Him. And so I think about seven things on the handout there. But we want to begin, first of all, by noting that never before was one born like Jesus. Never before was one born like Jesus. Now, when I say never before was one born like Jesus, I'm not simply speaking to the matter of His miraculous birth. The Bible is, I don't want to say it's filled, but the Bible has a number of miraculous births. In other words, there were a number of people born before Jesus who were born by miraculous means. Obviously, we could think about Isaac, where God obviously intervened in the life of two individuals to bring a child into the world. Jesus' own cousin, John the Baptist, also born by miraculous means. The couple who built the house or built the room for Elisha, they were without child, and God intervened in that case. So that's not what I'm talking about. Not just the miraculous part. I'm talking about the specifics of how Jesus was born. And the fact that Jesus was born, He was conceived and born completely and separate from the seed of a man. The Bible speaks of Him as being born of the seed of a woman, all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, and the incident where Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. The Bible says that God said to the serpent, "I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and you shall bruise his heel." In Galatians 4 and verse 4, Paul said to those brethren, he says, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, that He might redeem those that are under the law. And of course, Matthew 1 and beginning in verse 18, now the birth of Jesus was as follows. And then the account begins. As Mary conceived of the Holy Spirit. Luke's account gives a little more detail to that matter. But we understand that nobody was ever born like Jesus in the sense that He was born exclusively through the seed of woman. By the way, this doesn't get talked about as much now as it used to maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But even cloning doesn't meet the criteria of the birth of Christ. People don't, you remember they cloned the sheep, Dolly? They cloned the sheep, and they had this process by which they thought they would eventually clone human beings, and that God's not necessary, and all these types of foolish things. Cloning doesn't meet the criteria of the birth of Christ. You still have to, they start far down the process than the way that Jesus was born. And so no one was ever born like Jesus, in the sense that he was conceived apart from the seed of man. And so no one was ever born like him. But then secondly, no one ever lived like Jesus. Now, and there are some things we're going to spend a little time here, because I think this is really important, that no one ever lived like Jesus. Now, we use words and terminology in the English language that is not reflected in the language of the Bible. And by the way, I'll give you an example of how this works even in our own language. I never heard of a cotton stripper until about a week ago. Now, I've been around cotton pickers all my life. My family grows cotton in southeast Missouri. I know what a cotton picker is, but I don't know what a cotton stripper is. But I heard about guys falling off their strippers out here. And of course, that means something a whole lot different in Alabama than it does in West Texas. And so you see, sometimes the language is a little bit different. Well, we use the term perfect to describe Jesus in a lot of situations, in the sense we use that word perfect to describe him as never having sinned. The Bible never uses that word in regard to Jesus with regard to his sinlessness. It doesn't use the word perfect. When the Bible wanted to say that Jesus never sinned, here's what it said. Jesus didn't sin. Just come right out and said it. I mean, for example, in Hebrews 4 in verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. He did or knew no sin, neither was any guile found in his mouth. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22. God made him to be sin for us who knew no sin. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. When the Bible wants to say that Jesus didn't sin, it didn't say he was perfect. It said he didn't sin. Now, let me just ask you a question. Have you ever just sat down and tried to wrap your mind around that? We talk about it all the time, right? I mean, we talk about his sinlessness, and when we gather, I don't know if y'all do Lord's Supper table talks, but we started doing them back at the start of the pandemic, and I've been doing them every week, of course, more extensive than maybe most, but, we talk about the sinlessness of Christ a lot. We talk about, we mention it in our prayers. We talk about it when we extend the invitation. We talk about it about the Lord's Supper, around the Lord's table. But have you ever just sat and tried to wrap your mind around the sinlessness of Jesus? I mean, just for a moment, try to think about it. Try to think about it. It's not just that Jesus never did anything he wasn't supposed to do. He also did everything he was supposed to do. Now, I don't know if any of y'all have ever experienced this, but there have been times in my life when I've said some things, and about the time they got about this far out of my mouth, I wished I could grab them. So I see some of y'all nodding. See, y'all been there too? All right, so not just me. Good. That never happened to Jesus. Jesus never said anything and immediately regretted it. Also, he never said anything and later regretted it. Now, I mean, you start trying to think about that, that'll make your head hurt. Now, let's just carry this thing one step further. Jesus never thought anything that his Father didn't want him to think. Let's think, I hate traffic, all right? I live about 11 miles from town, and there's more traffic. Our town's got about 6,500 people in it, and it's got way more traffic than I'm really comfortable with. I don't like traffic.
Welcome to Ackerly.
Yeah, hey, I would love it here. I would love it here. Except for the fact that there's some things you can't get here and you have to go deal with traffic in Big Spring or Lamesa or Lubbock or so. But, I can get aggravated real easy in traffic. And I can start thinking some things I ought not think. Right? I mean, we've probably all been there, right? And that never one time happened to Jesus. Have you ever thought about things that when you really start trying to think about them, they make your chest get tight and your heart rate go up? When I start thinking about the sinlessness of Jesus, it does that to me. It's almost like if you're claustrophobic and you think about being in a tight space and your heart rate starts going up and you can feel your blood pressure rising. That happens to me when I think about the sinlessness of Jesus. It's just hard to even try to wrap your mind around it. He never did anything that he was not supposed to do. He always did exactly what he was supposed to do. He never said anything that he wasn't supposed to say. He always said the exact right thing every time that he opened his mouth. And then he never let one thought get in his mind that was contrary to the will of God or to the love of man. When the Bible said Jesus was sinless, there's a whole lot more than just one little old word in there. When we start thinking about his sinlessness. He was the Lamb of God, without spot, without blemish. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19. But there's a passage that speaks to Christ in this respect. It's Hebrews chapter 7. And it's in verse number 26. And it's speaking about the high priesthood of Jesus. But there are some adjectives here that describe Jesus that I think are worthy of our consideration. In Hebrews 7 and verse 26, it says, "For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and become higher than the heavens." I want to think about the first four of those adjectives. It says, first of all, it says he was holy. Holy. Now, this is not the word that you're going to find elsewhere in your Bible that is translated holy. That word is hagios. When you see the word holy, when you see the word saint, when you see the word sanctified, all those words are going to come from a root word, hagios, which is the word we would normally render as holy. This word is very closely related. It's hasios. It's not hagios, it's hasios. But what it means is that Jesus was of inherently good character. He was of inherently good character. I think about some of the greatest people that I've ever known. And I would put my mom's dad at the top of that list. My grandpa Burleson was one of the finest, maybe the finest man I ever knew. And people trust everywhere he went. He always served as a church treasurer. He served as an elder in church, a deacon in church. All the farmers in the area, they knew. Well, I'll give you an example. When my grandpa died in 96, his neighbor, Mr. Wiggs, lived next door, and at my grandpa's viewing, he came up and he said, my grandpa's initials were TD. That's what he went by, TD. He said, I lived next to your grandpa for 25 years. He said he never missed a service. He never missed any assembly at the church at Dexter. He said there'd be some Wednesday nights during harvest season. Because at Dexter, church started at 7:30 on Wednesday night to help the farmers out some. He said there'd be some services, so Wednesday nights. He said I'd look at my clock and it'd be 10 after 7, and I'd think to myself, just for a moment, TD's not going to make it tonight. He said I'd no sooner get the thought out of my head, and that pickup truck would just come gliding over the hill, ease into the carport. Grandpa only lived a mile and a half from the church building. He said, anytime I ever thought TD's not going to make it tonight, that GMC would come over top of that hill and coast right into the carport. He'd change clothes and he'd be at church. He's the greatest man I ever knew, but he wasn't without his flaws. There are things now that I'm old enough and I can look back and that I can see that he had flaws just like any other man. Jesus didn't have those flaws. I'll just give you. My grandpa did not like controversy. He just assumed everything be smooth all the time. And by the way, sometimes you got to have controversy. I mean, if you read 1 Corinthians 11, 18 to 20, it says that there's going to be controversy in the church so that people that are approved may be made manifest. I mean, sometimes you got to churn the milk, to get the cream to the top. But he did not like controversy. Well, that was problematic to serve as an elder, because you have to, at times, to deal with controversy. And so that would just be, I'd say that was one of his flaws. But Jesus didn't have any flaw like that. Jesus' love for all people was evident. And yet at the same time, he did not allow his love for people to dissuade him from engaging in controversy. Because if you're going to teach what Jesus taught, there's going to be controversy. If you're going to teach what Jesus taught about marriage, there's going to be controversy. If you're going to teach what Jesus taught about baptism, there's going to be controversy. I mean, if you're going to teach what Jesus taught about loving your enemies, there's going to be controversy. So Jesus was of absolute inherent good character. No flaws in him whatsoever. That's the word for perfect. Matthew 5:48. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the word for perfect. So he was holy, that hasios, of inherently good character. But then secondly it says he was harmless. Harmless. That word means he was the antithesis of evil or wickedness. In other words, if you could think of anything that was evil or anything that was wicked, Jesus was at the other end of that spectrum. He was as far away from wickedness, guile, evil as any person could possibly be. Never associated it. Back up. Never accurately associated with any of those things. And what you understand what I'm saying? Because there were times when Jesus was accused of being a sinner, right? You remember in John 9, they said, we know this man's a sinner. We know it. We know he's a sinner. The only guy that never sinned. But they knew he was a sinner. So he was incorrectly associated with sin at times, but Jesus was always on the opposite end of anything that was contrary to the will of God. John 8:29, I always do those things that please him. Man, I wish I could say that. That ought to be the goal of every Christian. To be able to say, I always do those things that please him. So he's harmless. And then he's undefiled, which means he is untainted in any way. Untainted in any way. Yeah. I don't know about some of y'all, but I've been prone to get food on my shirt. Has that ever happened to you, Randy? That's why he grew that beard, to keep the food, catch the food, to keep it off his shirt. That's a good plan. I can't grow a beard like that, so I just got stained shirts. But you think about how much square area is there on a shirt, and how much ketchup does it take to draw attention to it? Not very much. Not very much. That's what it's talking about here. He's untainted. You can look at that shirt inside and out, top and bottom, and there's not even so much as a speck of lint on it. Much less a ketchup stain or a mustard stain or barbecue or whatever whatever people might spill on a white shirt. He was absolutely untainted in every way. And then lastly, it says he was separate from sinners. Now that doesn't mean he didn't associate with sinners. We know that's not the case. What it means is that Jesus could never rightfully be accused of being a sinner. Now, I mentioned that just a minute ago out of John 9. But in John chapter 8, he said, which one of you convicts me of sin? Did you notice the wording there? He didn't say, which one of you accuses me of sin? He said, which one of you convicts me of sin? A big difference in accusations and proving a thing, isn't there? He says, which one of you convicts me of sin? In other words, you think you can build a case? Build it. You got a case against me as a sinner? Bring it. Bring it. Even when they accused his disciples of violating the Sabbath, they were wrong. They were wrong in that case, and Jesus defended them. Said, you would have not condemned the guiltless. If you knew what the Bible really said, you would have not condemned the guiltless. And so Jesus was not ever going to be accurately accused of being a sinner. So I love the adjectives there in Hebrews 7 and verse 26. But then number 3, no one did ever teach like Jesus. No one ever did teach or taught like Jesus. Matthew 7, 28 and 29, it says, he taught as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. He taught, Acts 1 and verse 1, teaching, but first by doing. Of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. Mark 6 teaches that he taught with great wisdom. Now, I know a little bit about teachers. All right? My wife is a teacher. My daughter is a teacher. My son is a teacher. My son-in-law is a teacher. And my stepdad's a retired teacher. My wife's best friend is a teacher. And one of my fellow elders and my best friend, one of my running partners, we eat out together every Saturday night. And Philip and I get so sick of hearing about school. It was actually a relief when Stephanie retired last year, because we didn't have to listen to discussions of school. And then you know what she started doing? Substitute teaching. I know a little bit about teachers, and I know what makes a good teacher. I understand that. But Jesus was a master. He was a master teacher. Now, when a person thinks about what makes a good teacher or a great teacher, usually great teachers, again, by human standards, are those who have found a way to teach and have mastered a particular method of teaching. Now, there are methods, different methods. And my wife talks about some of these old school teachers that they don't use any of the new means. They don't use any of the tools that are available to them to help kids learn. And to me, it's a tragedy. If you're going to teach, be the best teacher that you can be. And use all the tools at your disposal. But nobody ever masters every way of teaching. Some teachers are good lecturers. Some teachers are good illustrators. Some teachers are good to show you how to do hands-on learning. There's all different kinds. And by the way, there's different ways of lecturing. And if you've been to college, you understand, or you understand all of that. But I want you to think about Jesus mastered every way there was to teach. That's why he's the master teacher. There's no method of teaching by which Jesus was in any way inferior to any other person who ever lived. And so I was going to list a few of these here. For example, one of our deacons in my home congregation back southeast Missouri was also our band teacher. And he said there's 3 ways to learn: repetition, repetition, and repetition. Now, if you're teaching band, that's right. The only way you're ever going to learn it is just play it and keep playing it and keep playing it and and just keep playing it. But, obviously there are other ways to learn. But repetition is still a great way to learn. And Jesus taught by repetition. For example, we're going to look at the Sermon on the Mount this morning from Matthew 5, 6, and 7. But if you go over to Luke chapter 6, you're going to find almost that same sermon. Now, this is not one of those situations where Luke is describing the exact same event that that Matthew, in other words, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, you read about, say, the demoniac in the of the Gadarenes, or there are a number of events that are repeated, and it's the same event every time. All right, this will not be one of those cases. In Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you have the Sermon on the Mount, but Luke 6 says it's the Sermon on the Plain. But many of the things that are in the Sermon on the Mount were taught in the Sermon on the Plain. So what does that tell me? It tells me that Jesus had a body of work that needed to be heard by everybody. In other words, everywhere he went, Jesus wasn't like me and Randy. He didn't have to come up with new material every Sunday. I mean, think about it. I've been at Burleson 25 and a half years. I've prepared literally thousands of sermons. Thousands of different sermons. Now I don't expect that my brethren listen that close that I probably couldn't repeat some of them pretty regular and just retitle them and get away with it. But brethren expect you to have something. I hate the word new, but you know what I'm saying. You're not going to preach the same. You're not going to preach the same 20 sermons over and over throughout the course of the year and stay anywhere and preach those same 20 sermons and keep preaching them. But that's exactly what Jesus did. Except he probably didn't have 20. He probably just had one or two sermons that had to be preached everywhere he went. And one of them would have been the Sermon on the Mount. Because that message needed to be heard by everybody. So just think, if you're one of the apostles and you're with Jesus for about 3 years, how many times have you heard Sermon on the Mount? Or how many times have you heard the material that's in the Sermon on the Mount? And by the way, who more needed to hear that material than the men who were going to take over for him when he was ascended into heaven? In other words, the guys that heard it the most were the guys who needed to hear it the most. And even in his personal teaching, he kept trying to teach them the same thing over and over again. He started talking about his death in Matthew 16. It says, at that time, it's in about verse 21. In Matthew 16, 21 it says, at that time Jesus began to teach. And he starts talking about his death that's coming up. Began to teach means he taught it, but then he kept on teaching it. And that's borne out because we read about it in Matthew 16, we read about it in Matthew 17, we read about it in Matthew 20. Jesus kept talking to his disciples about his death, and they still didn't get it. Still didn't get it. But he was trying to help them get it. So there's this matter of repetition. So Jesus taught by repetition. He preached that body of knowledge that we see in the Sermon on the Mount everywhere that he went. But then there's like what's called narrative preaching, narrative teaching. The account of Lazarus in Luke 16, 19 to 21. I think your handout's probably got a typo on it. It may say Luke 19. It's Luke 16, 19 to 31. The narrative of the rich man and Lazarus. The parables are narrative type teaching. I am not a good narrative preacher. I didn't grow up hearing narrative preaching. I grew up hearing, as old said, I grew up hearing 3 points and a poem. That was the type of preaching I grew up hearing. And the guys that would hold gospel meetings for us, Wendell Winkler. You could sit down and listen to Wendell Winkler preach, and by the time he got done, if you were taking notes, you could reproduce his outline. You knew exactly what the theme was, and you knew exactly what every major point was, and you knew the scriptures that he was going to use with every point, and you might jot down. That's just that old kind of that's the kind of preaching I'm doing right now. That's probably what you're going to hear a lot of this week. All right, I'm not a very good narrative preacher. Guys like Tom Holland were incredible narrative preachers. You couldn't take notes to listen to Tom Holland preach because you just never knew when he was going from one point to the next. And I just quit trying to take notes. Man, I heard a guy one time. This is so funny. We were having our Wednesday night series. One of the area preachers I invited him, and he tried to preach one of Tom Holland's sermons, and it was a nightmare. It's like, dude, you ain't Tom Holland. If you're going to preach one of Tom's sermons, you need to record it and memorize it. Don't try to preach it by taking notes, because that's just not going to work. It was terrible. I didn't tell him it was terrible, but it was bad. All right, but Tom Holland's a great narrative preacher. You know, guys that can weave the Scripture through some type of narratives. I envy those guys. I really do. My mind just doesn't work that way. But Jesus used narrative preaching. He used the shock effect. Now, sometimes people say things to grab your attention and make you think. Well, how's this sound for you? Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. That was a jarring one, wasn't it? That was a kick to the head for sure. They didn't know what he meant by that. And by the way, there's still a lot of people reading the Bible that don't know what he meant by that. But, Jesus would say things to get people's attention. The shock value. In order to get your attention and make you like, look, I'm not going to sit here and spoon feed you all day long. You're going to have to think a little bit. And so Jesus used what we might refer to as shock value. Then Jesus also used what's called the Socratic method of teaching, which is to ask questions. Socrates was the master of asking questions. He would ask a student a question, a student would answer it, and then he would ask another question. And he would, what he was doing, he kept asking questions until he could get that thing boiled down, down to the nut. But Jesus was a master question asker. By the way, Socrates, lived prior to Jesus, and Jesus would have been very familiar with that. And also Aristotle, who taught by the means of rhetoric, which is a totally different style. But Jesus could take a situation and ask questions and get to the root of the matter. By the way, we learned that if you ever do the Fishers of Men evangelism program, asking questions is a big part of that. But for example, you can defuse a bad situation by asking questions. For example, they asked Jesus, they said, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Well, what did he say? He asked a question. He said, whose picture's on the money? In other words, he didn't have to answer the question. He responded by asking a question. They said, well, Caesar's picture's on the money. He said, then render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and unto God what belongs to God. And that matter was done. Over and over again through the polemic period of Jesus' work, he was a great question asker. The son of, when the Christ comes, whose son is he going to be? Well, they said he's going to be the son of David. They said, well, then why did David call him Lord? See, we miss that. He asked him a question, and they couldn't answer it. Hey, we're going to ask you a question. By what authority do you do these things, and who gave you this authority? Well, I'll ask you a question. If you answer my question, I'll answer yours. Matthew 21. See, he was the master of the Socratic method. And then there's the rhetorical method, which is what we would call this is like lawyer style preaching. You build the case. You gather all the evidence and you build the case. For example, when they accused Jesus' disciples of violating the Sabbath, eating with unwashed hands, by rubbing the grain. And what did Jesus do? He started building the case from David. You remember what David did? When he ate that showbread and it's only lawful for the priest to eat it? You know what the Bible says about mercy and not sacrifice? He starts building the case. And when he got done, he said, if you'd known what the facts are, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless. That's the rhetorical method. That's building the case and drawing a conclusion. This would be something, rhetorical preaching would be like, what must I do to be saved? Then I'm going to build the case. I'm going to take all, there's obviously more than you could preach in one sermon, but you understand, I'm going to take all the available evidence and then I'm going to build the case as to what a person has to do in order to be saved. And so that's the rhetorical method. And then there's object lessons, we might say audio visuals. Behold the lilies of the field, how they grow. What did they have to do to see that? Look around. Behold the fowls of the air. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't gather in the barns. Jesus could paint some pictures now. And even in the parables, a lot of times he was painting some really, really great pictures. And so these are just all different ways that Jesus used to teach. By the way, I'm not going to get done with this outline because I realize there's like 8 points, and I'm like 5 minutes from being done. But we're going to try to get to the most. We'll try to get through a little bit of the rest of it. Number 4, no one ever loved like Jesus. No one ever loved like Jesus. Greater love has no man than this, and a man lay down his life for his friends, and you're my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. New commandment I give to you, that you love one another. But what was the standard? Not just love one another. Love one another as I have loved you. In other words, there is no higher ethic than love. And nobody had the ability to exhibit or point to themselves as an example of that more than Jesus did. And he did that. He said, love one another as I have loved you. He said, this is how all men will know you're my disciples, if you have love one for another. But that last phrase is still tied to the as I have loved you. So no one ever loved like Jesus loved. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:14, the love of Christ compels us. I know y'all got some sick folks that are needing to be taken care of. When my grandpa got cancer back in the early 90s, my mom and stepdad just lived right down the road, about 0.2 of a mile. They moved in with my grandparents. And my mom took care of my grandpa almost till the day he died in 96. He had bone cancer. And he went to church and it didn't go like most bone cancers. He went to church on Sunday, went to farm on Monday, went to hospital Tuesday, died on Wednesday. That's a pretty good way to go if you got bone cancer. His brother wasn't that fortunate. But then right after my grandpa died, my grandma's breast cancer came back. And they couldn't do anything with her. I mean, there was nothing, just treat it and keep your pain down. My mom took care of her mom from 1996 to 2005, every day. And she died at home in hospice care. And when they died, or when my grandma died, I told my mom, I said, you don't ever have to worry about being taken care of. No matter what happens, I'm going to take care. Now, but where did I learn that? Her love for her parents was evident, and it's compelling. It's compelling. And in fact, when she built the house that I live in now, they left Missouri and moved to Alabama in 2006, and she built her house somewhat on the plan of my grandma's house. A family could live in the basement, and a family could live on the upstairs. There's 2 bedrooms upstairs, 2 down. 2 bathrooms upstairs, 2 down. Kitchen upstairs, kitchen downstairs. That whole house was built with the plan that at some point in time, we were all going to live in that house. And then Rhonda and I bought that house 5 years ago. My folks moved to Tennessee. But guess what? At some point, they're going to come back to Alabama. And I just tell you that to illustrate what love can compel people to do. And Paul says the love of Christ compels us. When's the last time you felt compelled by the love of Christ? And if it's been a while, then the only thing I can say is that you haven't seen it. And if you haven't seen it, whose fault is that? Whose fault is it that you haven't seen the love of Christ? Been compelled by the love of Christ? It's got to be my fault, because we've all it's been painted for us right here in this book. And the more time we'll spend in this book reading about our Lord, the more the love of Christ will compel us. And then number 5, how much we're going to quit? About now? All right. Well, the last 4 you're on your own. You just have to look them up and figure them out for yourself. All right.